Reflection often gets a bad reputation because it's slower than normal code. Now, what if I told you there was something else that was much like reflection but was much, much faster? Hi, my name is Nick Cosentino, and I'm a Principal Software Engineering Manager at Microsoft. In this video, we're going to look at benchmarks for unsafe accessors. Now, if you haven't seen my previous video, I'll link it right up here, so you can go check that out and come back, but that'll teach you all about the very basics of unsafe accessors and how we can call them. In this video, though, we are going to look at performance characteristics, so I'll walk us through some benchmark.net setup, and then we can look through the results of that. If that sounds interesting, remember to subscribe to the channel and check out that pinned comment for my courses on Dome Train. With that said, we'll jump over to Visual Studio, look at the benchmark.net setup, and then look at the results. All right, to kick things off, I have the type that we're going to be working with. So that's right here from line 9 through 19. And generally, when we're working with unsafe accessors, this is something that's going to allow us to access private members. Now, because I want to be able to compare these things to normal calls, I want to be able to use public here. So this is a slightly different setup. But the point of this is that I can't call a method or a field if it's private from the outside without using reflection or unsafe accessors. So just to make sure I have a direct comparison, I've made these public so that I can call them from the outside. And that way we can do a fair comparison. So I'm just going to be dealing with field, a method, and a property. I'm leaving the static part out of this just because it's going to double up all of the results that we need to look through. And I don't think that you're going to see anything that's dramatically different or surprising just by doing static. So very simple type to work with. I'm going to start walking through the different benchmarks that we have here. So the first benchmark is going to be for instantiation. So I have the constructor call here just marked as the baseline. This is just newing up our type. And then the other ones that we're going to be looking at here are just using activator create instance. You could also try to do comparisons with constructor info. You could do type invoke member. I do have other videos on these benchmarks if you want to check out the rest of my channel, but we're just going to limit it to activator create instance here. And then we're going to call the unsafe constructor, which I have defined right here from line 43 to 44. That's going to be it for instantiation. If we go a little bit further, we'll do benchmarks on getting field values. So you'll notice that I'm just going to have a cached version of instance field info so that we're not paying the penalty of looking this up every time. Again, in other videos I do show you the overhead of actually calling this code on line 58, but I do want to call out that for this video, let's assume that we've already cached that, and that way that's an optimization you can do to basically pay the penalty once and then not pay it every time. But we are going to look at just the sort of traditional way of getting a field value. That's why I had to make these things public. We're going to use reflection on that field info, and then again using unsafe accessors. So we are using the ref keyword here, and you can see the ref keyword again on line 81. We're just going to get that instance field and then return it back on all of these. The set field benchmarks are essentially the exact same, so I'll skim through them pretty quick. You'll notice that I'm just setting the value to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 across all of these. And then of course for the reflection scenario, I'm calling set value instead of get value. Next up are properties. These ones again, I will move through pretty quickly because it's going to be the same setup that we just saw, except for doing property info, and then we're going to obviously use the property name. So the other important thing to note though is that properties, when it comes to unsafe accessors, they are marked as methods, and you'll notice that the property name is technically just the method name. That's because unsafe accessors don't have a property accessor kind. They need to be method. If you're familiar with typing and properties and reflection in C# and .NET, then you'll know that the property syntax that we have is just like syntactic sugar. Everything behind the scenes is still a set and get method, just with the property name. So before moving on, this is just a quick reminder that I do have courses available on Dome Train. If you're interested in learning more about reflection, I've put together an entire reflection course. It's just over 5 hours long that walks you through all of the basics about reflection as well as some more complicated scenarios. If we have a quick look at the curriculum, you can see that we start diving into what types are in programming languages, how we can find types, how we can work with different member information on those types, and that includes some fancy things like being able to set private read-only fields, which is pretty wild. I do cover more advanced topics like generics, performance analysis, and some things that are beyond reflection. remember to check it out on Don't Train. Thanks, and back to the video. These benchmarks are set up in a very similar fashion, and the set property ones, again, almost identical, except we need to be able to get the property and then call set value when we're using reflection. So just wanted to make sure that was obvious between those two. The final set of benchmarks is just going to be calling the method that we have. So kind of like the other setups, we're caching the method info from reflection, and that way a little bit down here we can see that we're just going to be calling that cached method info. The unsafe accessor call right here, we need to pass in the instance, and then of course just traditional code when we're calling a method. This one hopefully doesn't look too complicated on line 215. I've already run these benchmarks and have the results, so I can save you a little bit of time and we can go check them out right now. Starting off, if we have a quick look at the ratio column, just a heads up that this ratio column is not going to be very well populated on all these results because some of these run so fast that it can't give you a very good accurate ratio. But if we look at Constructor Classic, just the normal way that we construct things, that is the baseline. It has a 1.0 ratio. We can see that Activator Create Instance is about twice as slow with a 2.04 ratio, but have a look at this last one. Unsafe, using the unsafe accessor, was even faster than calling a normal constructor, which is pretty incredible. This is probably not what I would recommend unless you had like a pretty extreme situation where you're just trying to get all the performance you can out of it. But I thought that was pretty impressive that we see something that's technically even faster. When it comes to memory allocated, everything's kind of flat across the board, so nothing interesting for memory. But truly the performance, you can see that even if you wanted to assume that it was on par with Classic, it's much faster than Reflection. Heading over to the get field benchmarks. This is where if we have a quick look at the ratio column, things are going to start to look pretty ridiculous. So kind of want to draw your eyes back over to the mean column on the far left, just to kind of show you that when we're dealing with fields and we're getting a field value, we're talking about, sub nanosecond. So it's quite fast, right? So 0.03, almost 0.04 nanoseconds, just to be able to access a field and get the value off of a instance, right? If we use reflection and using field info, it's 42 nanoseconds, so it's multiple orders of magnitude slower to use reflection just to be able to get a field. Now 42 nanoseconds is obviously, it's pretty fast, but when you're talking about doing these things in a hot path maybe many times, this might be something that you just don't want to do. But if we have a quick look at the final row here, we can see that instance field for unsafe, using an unsafe accessor, didn't even register time. So pretty incredible. Again, if you assume that this is even a rounding error, it would be at least on par with the classic way to just access a field. So again, I thought that was pretty amazing. Just a heads up, this code does run, because if you're like, well, hey, is it just throwing an exception and that's why it's not registering? Benchmark.net, if you were throwing an exception, would not complete the benchmark. So the fact that these are completing, and if you watch the previous video, which I linked, you'll see that when we're calling these unsafe accessors for fields, this truly does work. So pretty remarkable that we get basically almost no time registered when calling these things. A quick note too, that on the reflection scenario, we do get some memory allocated, so 24 bytes. And obviously for the classic call, we don't get any memory allocated, and unsafe is essentially the same. So reflection in this case is overall just worse because it's allocating memory and it's significantly slower relative to the other ways. Jumping down to being able to set fields. Again, the ratio column didn't even compute this time. That's why we have some question marks. You'll see that benchmark.net says that if we get a question mark here, it's because the baseline was too close to 0. So you can see that when we're setting it, we get a 0.0004 nanoseconds for the sort of traditional classic way of just setting a field on an instance. The reflection number here is very much like what we saw for getting the field value. So orders and orders of magnitude slower, still only like 40-ish nanoseconds. So fast, but not relatively speaking. The unsafe call was certainly slower by, again, orders of magnitude than the classic way, but I just wanted to call out that, like, compared to reflection, this is pretty incredible, right? Because it's still orders of magnitude faster than the reflection scenario. In this case, yes, reflection did allocate 24 bytes. Unsafe and the classic way of just setting a field are not allocating any memory. Moving things over to properties instead of fields. So these are technically method calls, right? So when we get a property value the classic way, we do see that we're at 0.06 nanoseconds. So still, it's extremely fast to be able to get a property. Reflection is orders of magnitude slower. This is kind of the pattern that we're seeing, right? 12 nanoseconds, still fast, but slower than the classic way of just doing things. But the unsafe accessor, again, ended up being faster in this example than just calling a property the classic way. So again, I'm pretty surprised looking at all these benchmarks, right, that we have things using unsafe accessors that are even faster sometimes when we're using those versus the classic way of doing things. So let's move on, because this is a similar pattern we've already seen, a couple of bytes allocated, but let's move on to the set and see if there's anything different there. Overall, for the set property benchmarks, nothing too interesting, especially compared to what we just saw, right? We see the classic way, very, very fast. Reflection, a couple of orders of magnitude slower, still, that 10 to 20 range for nanoseconds. And then the unsafe property, a little slower in this case than the classic way. So overall, extremely fast for unsafe. So again, very impressed with these. Finally, looking at method calls, just keep in mind that the properties that we saw, properties are technically just method calls, right? So these ones ended up printing in a different order, so I apologize, but that's why it might seem a little confusing. But the classic one at the very top, basically a classic method call, registered no time at all. That method itself, there's nothing to do inside of the body, but we still have to pay whatever overhead to call the method. And we can see that between the classic and unsafe way, literally no time registered. Again, if we put something inside of that method, it might do something, but that method is just returning a number. So even though, yes, there's no code executing inside of that method, it does have a return value. It's not a no-op, so it is still worth calling. And then the reflection line here that we have is 12 nanoseconds. So again, fast, but compared to the other two ways, just doesn't make any sense to be calling that unless you absolutely needed to do something with reflection. Overall, we can see that unsafe accessors are dramatically faster than using reflection, and in some cases even faster than the typical way that we might go write some code. Again, I'm not going to go recommend that you use unsafe accessors if you don't need to be doing that, and unsafe accessors are supposed to be giving us that power of being able to work with private members when otherwise we couldn't, so it should be a pretty niche use case. But like we can see, there are some interesting performance characteristics. I will remind you again that reflection and unsafe accessors don't quite solve the same problem. There's a bit of overlap, right? Like reflection can access things that are private, same with unsafe accessors, but reflection can be used for things more dynamically at runtime, so we can dynamically load up types, we can call things by their name. With unsafe accessors, we do need that information at compile time because we need to be able to write those signatures that give us unsafe accessors. I hope you found this video interesting, and I'd be very curious to hear from you how you might be using unsafe accessors in your code. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.